Good evening, church family. We are coming to the end of 5 weeks of sheltering in place in our homes. And that means it's been 5 weeks since we've been able to be together as a church family physically. But one of the beautiful things about our faith is that we are connected in more ways than just through our physical presence. We're connected spiritually through the creative action of our God who brought us all into this world, and by creating this world and by setting it in motion. Luckily, we've been able to connect through technology, through videos like this one, through text messages, emails, video calls, and I'm sure there's been much more. And we've been able to check on each other and to do all that we can to be there for one another during these times. And we've also been connected through practices like worship and singing that we do every Sunday, even if it's online. We're connected through practices like prayer and study of Scripture. We're connected through our baptism into the spiritually renewed family of God. And, of course, we are connected through the practice of communion, something that we continue to share together every week when we gather together. So a couple of months back, I began a sermon series called Believe, where I've been examining and trying to remind us of some of the very important beliefs that we hold and practice as believers in Jesus. So the first week we talked about the identity of God. And remember, God is like Jesus. The second week of this sermon series, we talked about our identity, that we're a community of one another's looking to one another, that we lift each other up, that we encourage and support each other, that we are there for one another. We talked about the practice of baptism, that baptism is a symbol of the transformation that God is working in all of our lives, and it's an invitation from God to life with Him. And now today, we're going to share in a conversation about communion, about the Lord's Supper. And may I remind you once more that one sermon is not nearly enough to be able to share all that there is with this topic and with this practice. And so yes, I will repeat my mantra, I will leave you disappointed, because I'm not going to be able to talk about everything today. But this is a key practice, and it's central to our faith. And so let's embark on this journey together today. To get us started, I think there's one thing that we absolutely need to have in our back pocket. We have to know this. We have to be aware of this. So I'm not sure if any of you saw the epic blockbuster film that came out probably close to 20 years ago now. It's called Mean Girls. And it's a story of a girl who moves to the United States after living overseas with her parents. And when she was living overseas, she was homeschooled. And when they moved here, she began to attend a local high school, the first time she had ever been a part of public education. And so, of course, she has to learn the culture of her high school. She has to learn all the groups that are there, who can talk to who and who can't, who's popular and who isn't. Now, of course, this is not a perfect one-to-one equivalent to what we're talking about with the topic of communion. And really, if you think about it, it's not even that close at all. But there's this one scene where the main character is learning who everybody is, learning the popularity of everyone, and how they're able to interact with each other. There's the jocks, there's nerds, there's popular girls, there's goths, and on, all of these cliques and groups are defined and shown. And then when it comes to lunchtime in the cafeteria, all the groups sit only with their own group. And it's actually because of something that we learn about in Scripture. It's the idea of table fellowship. Now, it has nothing to do with the kinds of labels that are present in a high school, but it has everything to do with who you are. And especially in the biblical concept, with who you are before God. You see, table fellowship was a sign of holiness. It was a sign that you were obeying the laws of God, that you took your life with God seriously. And especially as the Jewish world context will become increasingly more and more complex as the Old Testament progresses, and there's all these foreign nations who are coming and ruling over the people of Israel, table fellowship becomes incredibly significant. To eat with your fellow Jewish people means that you're following the laws of purity, that you're concerned with what you eat, that you're concerned with the laws of God. To break table fellowship with your fellow Jewish men and women, and to eat with the Babylonians or the Greeks or the Romans means that you're no longer following the laws that God has given to his people. You're no longer identified as one of God's chosen people. This idea can be found all over the pages of the First Testament. We have laws found in the book of Leviticus, like this one, found in Leviticus 11, 7 through 8, where animals like pigs are forbidden because they are unclean. And before that, in Leviticus chapter 11, we also find out that animals like the camel, the rock badger, and the hare are unclean. After these verses in chapter 11, we find out that you can't eat sea creatures that don't have scales or fins. Anything like that is out. So that means no lobster, no shrimp, no octopus, or anything like that. You can't eat eagles, vultures, rams, owls, and there's so much more. On and on the list goes in the book of Leviticus. These animals are unclean, and by eating them, you yourself become unclean. Now, for us, that might sound odd, but for the ancient world, this was important because it helped with their health, with the sanitation of the community. Many of these animals, there's a pretty good reason why you shouldn't eat them. They might carry disease, or for some other reason, they are considered out of the question for people who are trying to follow God. Now, this is just one passage that we see. There's others all over the Old Testament. So we see scenes like in Daniel chapter 1, when Daniel is taken from his homeland to the land of Babylon. And he is there in the capital city of Babylon, and he is brought into the service of the king. And Daniel refuses to eat the food that is prepared for them, the wine that the king offers to his servants, but instead he's going to remain eating the diet that he had while he was living in his homeland. He offers to eat only vegetables because the meat that he is offered is unclean. Now, as it turns out, as this passage progresses, Daniel's diet is proven to be even better than the diet of the king. And so Daniel is, he's proven correct. He's able to keep practicing the dietary laws that he's been able to practice his entire life. There's stories like in the book of Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 29, before we get to that oh so famous verse in Jeremiah 29, there's stories about whether or not you can associate with people. And in Jeremiah 29, Jeremiah prophesies on behalf of God to the people of Israel who are living in exile, and he tells them to settle down in their new homeland, to promote the welfare of their society, even to marry people from Babylonian backgrounds. Now, of course, there's the opposite is true also in Scripture when we read in the book of Ezra. Coming out of the exile, as the people are returning back to their homelands, the Israelite people choose to leave behind their foreign wives and families. And it's all because of this question of table fellowship. Who's allowed to sit with who and why? Will you become unclean if you sit and eat with them, if you interact with them, if you live with them? And so this idea of table fellowship is incredibly important when we talk about the Gospels, when we understand, when we start reading stories about Jesus eating meals with people. Because who you sat with was a symbol, at least to the Jews, of whether or not you were following God, whether or not you were obeying God. And so Jesus is born into this kind of a situation. He's living in the area that was promised to his ancestors. But they're under the rule of a foreign king, a foreign emperor, and this king does not recognize the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not only that, but Jesus and his disciples and the people that he interacts with are living in their promised land. But there are Jewish people living all over the ancient world in the diaspora, meaning that they're scattered, that they've been taken from the exiles hundreds of years before, and their parents and their grandparents, and they continue to live all throughout the ancient world. And so this issue of table fellowship is incredibly important because who you sit with matters. It shows whether or not you are listening to God. It shows whether or not you are following and obeying God, whether you are doing the will of God. And it's closely tied into the idea of holiness. Holiness is the idea that you are set apart by God and for God's purposes. And so who you sit with at table might just show whether or not you are being set apart, whether you are following God, whether you are practicing holiness. Now, of course, everything that we've talked to up until this point is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing. But this is the situation that Jesus was born into. And so, of course, yes, it is a good thing to be obedient to God and to follow the instructions that we receive from God. But when we read in the Gospels about Jesus, it's really interesting because Jesus has chances over and over again to disrupt these ideas about table fellowship and about holiness. And especially when these things are brought together to the point of pride and the exclusion of other people, Jesus is absolutely going to take the opportunity to disrupt these ideas. And Jesus, of course, doesn't do this because he has a vendetta against his own people. He does it instead because he wants to reveal something about who God is to us, so that these kinds of practices can become even more meaningful. Who you sit with, what kinds of foods you eat, whether or not you are set apart for God's purposes. These kinds of practices will become even more meaningful to the people who are seeking to follow God. So when we get to the Gospels, one of the things that we begin to notice is just how much Jesus is eating. He's always going to somebody's house and he's always sharing a meal with someone. And so especially in the Gospel of Luke, it's like you're moving from one dinner scene to the next. And you're just going to dinner after dinner after dinner. And every time you read one of these stories, your mouth begins to water a little bit. And you begin to get a little hungry yourself. And throughout all of the Gospels, we begin to pick up on a few of these ideas that Jesus has about table fellowship and how he wants to transform this practice and transform what the people understand about who they are meant to be. And so before we talk about the practice of communion or the Lord's Supper, I'd like to talk about a couple of things that Jesus has on his mind when he sees these table fellowship practices. Things that we can learn from Jesus and begin to understand and help us when we come to this topic of communion. So the first idea that we see in Scripture, the first idea that I want to point out to us is this idea that the table is even bigger than you know. So look with me at this passage in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, verses 12 through 24. Then Jesus said to the person who had invited him, "When you host a lunch or dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers and sisters, your relatives or rich neighbors. If you do, they will invite you in return, and that will be your reward. Instead, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, crippled, lame, and blind, and you will be blessed because they can't repay you. Instead, you will be repaid when the just are resurrected." Now, when one of the dinner guests heard Jesus' remarks, he said to Jesus, "Happy are those who will feast in God's kingdom." Jesus replied, "A certain man hosted a large dinner and invited many people. When it was time for the dinner to begin, he sent his servant to tell the invited guests, 'Come, the dinner is now ready.' One by one, they all began to make excuses. The first one told him, 'I bought a farm and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I bought 5 teams of oxen and I'm going to check on them. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.' When he returned, the servant reported these excuses to his master. The master of the house became angry and said to his servant, 'Go quickly to the city's streets, the busy ones and the side streets, and bring the poor, crippled, blind, and lame.' The servant said, 'Master, your instructions have been followed, and there is still room.' The master said to the servant, 'Go to the highways and the back alleys and urge people to come in so that my house will be filled. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will taste my dinner.'" For Jesus, the table is bigger than you know. Jesus has 2 major points that he wants to make in these verses. And the first is that the table is not for you. So when you invite guests to a meal, don't invite people for your own benefit. That's not the way of the kingdom of heaven. Instead, Jesus says, invite the people who will be blessed by being invited. Jesus thinks this matters immensely. The table is bigger than you know, and it's not for you. The second thing that Jesus wants people to see in this passage is that there's still more room at the table. He sends his servant out multiple times. He says, go and find more to come in, because those who had first been invited have rejected the invitation. Now, this passage is especially significant for Israel's history and for the future of the church. I think the primary interpretation about this passage that we can understand is about the inclusion of the Gentiles into the church. What Jesus is doing is for more than just the Jewish people. It's for the entire world. But the Jewish people have turned their backs on God as the first invited guests. And so now God is seeking to bring further people into his banquet. There is room at the table for more. So as we continue to live into the reality of God, the kingdom of heaven on earth today, we can seek to be participants in bringing that reality here. And I think it's really important for us to remember that there is still more room at the table. There's room at the table for the people who aren't here yet. There's room for those who we might be tempted to think don't deserve a seat. There's room at the table even for those who have hurt us in significant ways. There's room at the table for those who seem far from God right now. What Jesus wants us to see in this passage is that God is seeking after them too. And there's room at the table, because the table is bigger than we know. And if we truly believe that we're a priesthood of believers, that we are participants with God in bringing about the future that God is working to bring in the world, then we are holding invitations. And we have the ability to share those invitations with others. Now, the second thing that I'd like to mention before we get to the topic of the Lord's Supper is that the table of Jesus is a table of extravagance, not scarcity. Look with me at a passage that we can find in the Gospel of Mark. This comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, starting in verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him everything they had done and taught. Many people were coming and going, so there was no time to eat. So Jesus said to the apostles, "Come by yourselves to a secluded place and rest for a while." They departed in a boat by themselves for a deserted place. Many people saw them leaving and recognized them, and so they ran ahead from all the cities and arrived before them. When Jesus arrived and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. Late in the day, his disciples came to him and said, "This is an isolated place, and it's already late in the day. Send them away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy something to eat for themselves." He replied, "You give them something to eat." But they said to him, "Should we go off and buy bread worth almost 8 months' pay and give it to them to eat?" He said to them, "How much bread do you have? Take a look." After checking, they said, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. He directed the disciples to seat all the people in groups as though they were having a banquet on the green grass. They sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he looked up to heaven. He blessed them, broke the loaves into pieces, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all, and everyone ate until they were full. They filled 12 baskets with the leftover pieces of bread and fish. About 5,000 people had eaten. This scene and the ones that are like it that are recorded all over the Gospels show us that Jesus provides plenty, even to the point where there are baskets and baskets of leftovers. And Jesus feeds thousands of people, even when it seems like there's not enough for even a few people to eat. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the story of Babette's feast. Babette is a French refugee who comes to live in the home of 2 Danish sisters, and she's their servant. She's working for them. Amazingly, one day she wins the lottery. And so she decides to spend her winnings by preparing an extravagant meal for the sisters and for their friends who are in the town. She spends all of her winnings on one meal that's to be shared and enjoyed by all who are there. It's this beautiful snapshot of what the table is like in the kingdom of heaven. It's a table of extravagance. There's no need to be stingy at this table because God can and does provide all that we need. Even in this scene, when the people are found in the wilderness, when there doesn't seem to be enough, God comes through and God provides for our needs. He fills us completely because the feast that God has prepared for us is not one of scarcity. It's one of abundance and extravagance. And so, when we arrive now at our passage where Jesus is gathered with his disciples during that final week before his crucifixion, the week that we remembered just last week, Jesus prepares to sit down at a table one more time with his followers. And this table is incredibly significant because it's at this table that all the tables that have come before have been leading us to. It's at this table that all those other tables that Jesus sat down at with his disciples, with people who had questions, with the Pharisees and teachers of the law, with the outcasts, with all of those people, all of those tables find the fullness of their significance in this table. Because it's at this table that we receive one of the great gifts and reminders from God to us of God's grace. It's a beautiful reminder of what is about to happen. And for the disciples and for those who follow Jesus to this day, this meal and what happens after it is going to completely change all of history from that point forward. This table is prepared for the followers of Jesus as a signpost of the definitive action of God in the world. The action of God through Jesus that will start to heal our wounds. The action of God through Jesus that we will see our bondage to sin and self-interest broken. The action of God through Jesus where the problem of evil is addressed and we finally know fully that God is with us in the midst of our pain. The action of God through Jesus where death is defeated and hope now returns to our hearts and lives. We share this meal to remember the sacrifice that God made on our behalf. That God rescues, redeems, saves, heals, delivers, and restores us. Read with me what Jesus has to say in this passage in Luke chapter 22, verses 14 through 20. When the time came, Jesus took his place at the table, and the apostles joined him. He said to them, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. I tell you, I won't eat it until it is fulfilled in God's kingdom." After taking a cup and giving thanks, he said, "Take this and share it among yourselves. I tell you that from now on I won't drink from the fruit of the vine until God's kingdom has come." After taking the bread and giving thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup after the meal, and he said, "This cup is the new covenant by my blood, which is poured out for you." Jesus invites us to remember this meal. He invites us to share in this meal, to share in his sacrifice, to live as the kind of people who are changed by what Jesus will do at the cross, to be people who proclaim that the tomb is empty and that there is hope in this world, that no matter what our circumstances are, our lives are completely devoted to God through Christ, that in 2020 and beyond, there is still reason to have hope. Because the work that God has done through Jesus makes a way for all to come to the table. That the sacrifice of Jesus was not just barely enough to rescue us, but that it was an example of the extravagant love and provision of God. That there is grace available to us all, that God has made a way. And so whenever we share in this meal together, whenever we think about the Lord's Supper and the communion meal, every Sunday when we share this together, I hope that you'll remember these things. That the table is bigger than we know, and there's room for still more. that God's table is one of extravagance, not scarcity, and that this is God's great gift and reminder to us of God's grace. The table is set, and it is for all of God's children.